I'm Isla Vexley, 27 years old. Until 6 months ago, I believed family meant showing up for each other no matter what. Then my sister Camilla's divorce announcement changed everything. While I was quietly fighting stage 2 lymphoma, my entire family rallied around her custody battle like it was a national emergency. My mother organized legal strategy sessions. My father researched divorce attorneys. Meanwhile, I drove myself to chemotherapy appointments and celebrated my final treatment. Alone in a hospital parking lot, the irony wasn't lost on me. I was literally fighting for my life while they fought over Instagram follower counts and custody schedules. But here's what makes this story even more unbelievable. The day I got my cancer-free diagnosis, Camilla announced she was writing a memoir about her journey through betrayal. How do you compete with someone who turns every paper cut into a documentary? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra. Special for you? The Vexley family lived in a craftsman house in Portland's Hawthorne district, the kind of neighborhood where people paid extra for the privilege of living near artisanal coffee shops and vintage bookstores. From the outside, we looked like the perfect upper-middle-class family. My father, Dr. Isla Vexley, taught literature at Portland State University. My mother, Margot, managed a nonprofit focused on literacy programs. My sister, Camilla, had parlayed her college sorority popularity into a modest but lucrative lifestyle. Brand on Instagram, and then there was me, the quiet one, the easy one, the one who never caused problems. I worked as a freelance graphic designer from my small apartment in Southeast Portland, creating logos for local businesses and designing wedding invitations for friends of friends. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and allowed me the flexibility to work around my treatment schedule. Not that anyone in my family knew I had a treatment schedule. The morning everything changed. Started like any other family gathering. We met for Sunday brunch at our usual spot, a trendy restaurant where the mimosas cost $18 and came garnished with organic edible flowers. I arrived first, as always, claiming our reserved table for 4. The hostess knew us by name. The Vexleys had been coming here for 3 years running. Camilla swept in 15 minutes late, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite her claims of being too stressed to function. She wore a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget and oversized. Sunglasses that she didn't remove even after sitting down. I can't even begin to tell you the morning I've had, she announced before anyone could say hello. Derek's lawyer filed another motion. They're trying to claim I'm an unfit mother because I posted that video of Sophia eating ice cream for breakfast last Tuesday. My mother immediately shifted into crisis management mode. What did your attorney say? Should we be documenting their harassment? That's exactly what I told her, Camilla said, finally removing her sunglasses to reveal perfectly applied makeup that suggested her morning hadn't been quite as traumatic as advertised. We need to start keeping a paper trail of everything. Every text, every email, every time he's late picking up Sophia. My father arrived as Camilla was detailing her ex-husband's latest transgression, Dr. Ellis. Vexley was a man who preferred books to people, ideas to emotions. He kissed my mother's cheek, nodded at Camilla, and gave me a brief smile before burying himself in the menu he'd memorized years ago. Dad, you need to hear this, Camilla continued. Derek's trying to use my social media against me in court. Can you believe that? He's literally trying to paint me as irresponsible because I share authentic moments of my life online. I sipped my coffee and watched the familiar dynamic unfold. Camilla would present her latest crisis. My mother would offer increasingly elaborate solutions, and my father would provide occasional legal insights from his limited understanding of family law. I would sit quietly, offering supportive nods and asking thoughtful questions that kept the conversation flowing. It was a role I perfected over 27 years. The supportive younger sister, the one who listened without judgment, the one who never demanded center stage. I'd been playing this part so long I'd almost forgotten it was a performance. The worst part, Camilla said, gesturing dramatically with her fork, is that he's trying to make this about money. Like I'm some kind of gold digger who trapped him into marriage. Never mind that I supported his startup dreams for 3 years. While working full-time at the marketing agency, my mother reached across the table to squeeze Camilla's hand. Honey, everyone who knows you understands what kind of person you are. The court will see through his manipulation. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that had become a constant companion over the past months. At first, I'd attributed it to stress from work deadlines or too much caffeine. When the fatigue started, I blamed it on poor sleep. When the night sweats began, I told myself I needed to adjust my thermostat. It wasn't until I found the lump in my neck that I finally made a doctor's appointment. Isla, you're being unusually quiet, my mother observed, as if my silence was an anomaly rather than my default setting. What do you think about all this? I looked up from my untouched eggs Benedict. I think Camilla's doing an amazing job handling an impossible situation, I said, which is true enough. Camilla had always been gifted at turning personal drama into public sympathy. See? Camilla beamed. This is why Isla's my favorite sister. I'm your only sister, I reminded her. A old joke that had lost its charm somewhere around my 10th birthday. Details, Camilla waved dismissively. The point is, you get it. You understand that sometimes life just dumps garbage on you for no reason, and all you can do is try to clean it up with grace and dignity. I almost laughed at that. Camilla's idea of grace and dignity involved daily Instagram stories documenting her healing journey and weekly Facebook posts about the importance of choosing yourself in times of adversity. She turned her divorce into a brand complete with affiliate links to self-help books and meditation apps, but I couldn't judge her too harshly. We all found different ways to cope with the unexpected curveballs life threw at us. Camilla chose publicity, I chose privacy. Neither approach was inherently wrong, but they were fundamentally incompatible. Speaking of cleaning up garbage, my father interjected with the kind of academic precision that made him an excellent professor and a sometimes frustrating parent. Have you considered mediation instead of litigation? The research suggests that children of divorce experience less long-term trauma when parents can resolve conflicts without courtroom drama. Camilla's expression hardened. Dad, I tried mediation. Derek used it as an opportunity to lecture me about fiscal responsibility, while his lawyer took notes for the custody hearing. Some people can't be reasoned with. This launched my parents into a detailed discussion of various conflict resolution strategies, each backed by studies and statistics that my father had apparently memorized. I found myself watching the conversation like a tennis match, my head turning from speaker to speaker while my thoughts drifted to the appointment I had. Scheduled for Tuesday afternoon. Dr. Patricia Wong, my oncologist, had been cautiously optimistic during our last visit. The tumors were responding well to treatment, she'd said. My lymph nodes were shrinking. My blood work looked encouraging. But she'd used phrases like cautiously optimistic and trending positive, the kind of careful language that medical professionals deployed when they didn't want to make promises they couldn't keep. I hadn't told my family about Dr. Wong or the chemotherapy or the sleepless nights when I researched survival statistics on medical websites. The initial diagnosis had come during Camilla's separation announcement, and there had never been a good moment to interrupt the ongoing family crisis with news of my own medical emergency doc. Besides, what was I supposed to say? Hey everyone, I know Camilla's going through a really tough time, but I have cancer. It felt selfish and attention-seeking, like I was trying to upstage her legitimate emotional crisis with my own health drama dot, so I kept quiet. I'd scheduled my appointments for times when I was supposed to be working on client projects. I'd told my family I was taking on fewer jobs to focus on building my portfolio. I'd perfected the art of wearing makeup to hide the fatigue and styling scarves to disguise the port in my chest where they administered the chemotherapy drugs. The irony was that keeping my cancer secret had become almost as exhausting as the cancer itself. Earth to Isla, Camilla's voice cut through my mental fog. I asked if you wanted to come to Sophia's soccer game next Saturday. I could use some family support, and you know how much she adores her Aunt Isla. I loved my 6-year-old niece with the fierce protective instinct that seemed to skip generations in our family. Sophia had inherited Camilla's blonde hair and green eyes, but she'd somehow missed the gene for drama and self-absorption. She was curious and kind and blissfully unaware that her parents' divorce was being litigated on social media. I'd love to, I said, already calculating whether I'd be feeling well enough to sit in the sun for 2 hours. My next chemotherapy session was scheduled for Thursday, which meant Saturday would fall right in the middle of my usual post-treatment fatigue cycle. Perfect, Camilla said, pulling out her phone to add the game to her calendar. I'll text you the details, and maybe afterward we can grab lunch and you can help me brainstorm content ideas for my blog. I'm thinking about starting a series called Divorce Diaries, Raw, honest posts about the emotional journey of reclaiming your identity after betrayal. My mother practically glowed with enthusiasm. That sounds like a wonderful way to help other women going through similar experiences. Exactly, Camilla said. I mean, if my pain can help even one person feel less alone, then maybe this whole nightmare will have been worth something. I excused myself to use the restroom, needing a moment away from the suffocating enthusiasm for Camilla's latest project. In the mirror above the sink, I examined my reflection with the critical eye I developed over months of hiding my illness. The concealer was holding up well enough to disguise the dark circles under my eyes. The blush I'd applied that morning was still giving my cheeks the illusion of healthy color, but I looked tired in a way that went deeper than makeup could fix. I looked like someone carrying a secret that was slowly wearing her down from the inside. When I returned to the table, the conversation had shifted to logistics. Who would drive Sophia to her various activities while Camilla attended mediation sessions, whether my parents should hire a lawyer to advise them on grandparents' rights, how to handle Sophia's questions about why Daddy wasn't living at home anymore. I listened to my family strategize solutions to problems that hadn't occurred. Yet, while I faced actual, present-tense challenges that they didn't even know existed, the disconnect was so profound it felt almost surreal. We should probably head out, my father said eventually, glancing at his watch. I have papers to grade, and your mother has that board meeting this afternoon. We gathered our belongings with the practiced efficiency of people who'd shared hundreds of family meals. Camilla hugged each of us goodbye, her embraces lasting just long enough to feel performative. My parents exchanged the kind of coordinated dance that couples developed after decades of marriage. He held her coat while she gathered her purse. She reminded him about the grocery list while he calculated the tip. I walked to my car alone, as always, promising to call Camilla about Saturday's soccer game and assuring my mother that I was eating enough vegetables and getting adequate sleep. The drive back to my apartment took me through the heart of Southeast Portland, past the familiar landmarks that had become the backdrop to my double life. the coffee shop where I'd first Googled lymphoma symptoms. On a Tuesday morning in March, the pharmacy where I picked up my anti-nausea medication using a fake name to avoid questions from the chatty pharmacist who knew my family. The park where I'd sat in my car after my first chemotherapy session, crying from exhaustion and relief and the strange loneliness of facing the biggest challenge of my life without. The people who were supposed to love me most stopped by the time I reached my apartment. The familiar weight of isolation had settled over me like a heavy blanket. I made myself a cup of tea and settled onto my couch with my laptop, intending to work on a logo design for a local bakery. Instead, I found myself staring at a blank screen, wondering how much longer I could maintain this careful balance between truth and performance. My phone buzzed with a text from Gideon. How was family brunch? Did you tell them? Gideon Marsh had been my closest friend since college, the one person who knew about my diagnosis and treatment. He'd driven me to my first oncology appointment when I was too scared to go alone. He'd sat with me during chemotherapy sessions, working on his laptop while I dozed in the reclining chair. He grocery shopped for me on the days when I was too weak to leave my apartment. I typed back, not yet. Camilla's divorce drama reached new heights of complexity. His response came immediately. Your health isn't drama, Isla, it's real life. I stared at his message for a long time before typing. I know, it's just complicated. But even as I sent the text, I wondered if I was lying to him or to myself. Nothing about my situation was actually complicated. It was just uncomfortable. And I'd spent so many years avoiding discomfort that I'd forgotten how to recognize when avoidance became its own form of harm. Outside my apartment window, Portland carried on with its Sunday afternoon rhythm. Families walked dogs and pushed strollers along the tree-lined streets. Couples shared coffee on cafe patios. Life continued in its normal, predictable patterns while I sat in my living room, holding secrets that felt too heavy to carry but too dangerous to put down. I closed my laptop and curled up on my couch, pulling a soft throw blanket over my legs. In a few hours, I would need to prepare for the week ahead, client deadlines, grocery shopping, the usual maintenance tasks of adult life. But for now, I allowed myself the luxury of simply being tired without having to explain or justify or perform wellness for anyone else's comfort. It was a small freedom, but it was mine. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of drizzle that made Portland famous, and my chemotherapy appointments feel even more depressing. I sat in Dr. Wong's waiting room, surrounded by motivational posters about courage and strength that someone with good intentions had probably chosen to inspire hope in cancer patients. Instead, they reminded me that I was supposed to be feeling brave and empowered about my medical treatment when mostly I just felt tired and isolated. Isla Vexley? The nurse called my name with the practiced cheerfulness that all medical professionals seemed to master. I followed her down the familiar hallway, past examination rooms where other patients faced their own private battles. Dr. Wong greeted me with her usual combination of warmth and clinical efficiency. She was probably my mother's age, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of steady presence that made you believe she'd seen everything and could handle whatever came next. How are you feeling? She asked, settling into her chair with my chart. Tired, I admitted. The fatigue seems to be getting worse instead of better. That's normal at this stage of treatment, she assured me. Your body is working hard to heal itself. The important thing is that your latest scans show continued improvement. The tumors are responding exactly as we hoped they would. She pulled up images on her computer screen, pointing to areas where the cancer had shrunk since my last visit. To me, they looked like abstract art, swirls of gray and white that somehow contained the story of my body's fight for survival. But Dr. Wong read them like a familiar language, translating hope and progress from shadows and light. Based on these results, I think we can start discussing your transition to maintenance therapy, she continued. You've completed the intensive phase of treatment successfully. Your prognosis is excellent. The word excellent should have filled me with relief and joy. Instead, I felt a strange kind of panic. For months, cancer treatment had given structure to my days and purpose to my secrecy. If I was getting better, if I was, in fact, going to survive this, then I would eventually have to explain to my family why I'd hidden the entire experience from them. That's wonderful news, I managed to say, though my voice sounded hollow. Even to me, Dr. Wong studied my face with the perceptive gaze of someone trained to read between the lines of patient responses. Isla, I have to ask, how is your support system handling your recovery? Are your family and friends helping you process this transition? I stared at my hands, folded carefully in my lap. My family doesn't actually know about my diagnosis. The silence that followed felt heavy with professional judgment. Dr. Wong had probably seen every possible variation of family dysfunction in her years of treating cancer patients, but my situation seemed to surprise even her. May I ask why you made that choice? She said finally, her tone carefully neutral. My sister is going through a difficult divorce, I explained, as if that justified months of medical secrecy. The timing never seemed right to add more stress to the family dynamic. Isla, Dr. Wong said gently, cancer isn't something new. Add to family stress. It's something that requires family support. The research is very clear about the importance of social connections during treatment and recovery. I knew she was right. I'd read the same studies she was probably thinking about, data showing that cancer patients with strong support networks had better outcomes, faster recovery times, improved quality of life. But research couldn't account for the specific ecosystem of the Vexley family, where attention was a finite resource and Camilla had already claimed the majority share. I have support, I said. My friend Gideon has been amazing. And everyone here has been wonderful. Dr. Wong nodded, but I could see she wasn't entirely satisfied with my answer. I'd like you to consider telling your family soon. Not because you owe them information about your medical care, but because keeping this secret might be preventing you from fully processing your own recovery. She handed me a pamphlet about support groups for young adult cancer survivors. These meetings happen twice a month. You might find it helpful to talk with other people who understand what you've been through. I accepted the pamphlet and promised to consider attending a meeting, though we both probably knew I wouldn't follow through. I'd become too comfortable with isolation to suddenly embrace group therapy and shared experiences. After my appointment, I drove to the small cafe where I often went to decompress after medical visits. It was the kind of place that attracted freelancers and remote workers, people who needed Wi-Fi and caffeine and the ambient noise of other humans without the pressure of actual conversation. I ordered my usual lavender latte and claimed a corner. Table where I could observe the Tuesday afternoon crowd without being observed in return. A woman about my age sat near the window, typing intensely on her laptop while periodically checking her phone. A retired couple shared a scone and discussed their travel plans for the fall. A man in his 30s read a paperback novel while eating soup that looked more Instagram-worthy than nutritious. All of these people probably had families who knew basic facts about their lives, where they worked, what they worried about, whether they were facing any major health challenges. The simplicity of that transparency suddenly seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford. My phone buzzed with a text from Camilla. Emergency family meeting tonight. Derek's lawyer dropped another bombshell. Can you be at Mom and Dad's by 7? I stared at the message, trying to decode what qualified as an emergency in the context of a divorce that had been ongoing for 6 months. Camilla had a tendency to escalate routine legal proceedings into crisis-level family meetings, but my parents always responded as if each development was genuinely urgent. I typed back, "What happened?" Her response came immediately. "He's claiming I've been hiding assets. His forensic accountant found the money I set aside for Sophia's college fund, and he's trying to say I was planning to steal it. This is insane, Isla. I need family support tonight." The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being summoned to provide emotional support for someone whose biggest problem was having too much money to hide, while I'd been managing a cancer diagnosis without any family involvement whatsoever. But I texted back my agreement to attend the meeting and spent the rest of the afternoon working on client projects, trying to focus on font selections and color palettes instead of the growing exhaustion that seemed to seep deeper into my bones each day. By 7 o'clock, I was sitting in my parents' living room watching my family dissect the latest developments in Camilla v. Derek with the intensity of political strategists planning a campaign. My mother had prepared a pot of coffee and arranged store-bought cookies on a plate, as if caffeine and sugar could solve the fundamental problem of two people who'd married young and discovered they were incompatible partners. The forensic accountant is clearly biased, Camilla was saying, pacing in front of the fireplace like a lawyer addressing a jury. Derek's team specifically requested someone who specializes in finding hidden assets, which means they went into this investigation assuming I was guilty of financial misconduct. My father looked up from the legal documents spread across the coffee table. The college fund isn't technically hidden if it's in an account with your name on it, but I can see how a forensic accountant might question why you moved that money without discussing it with Derek first. Because Derek thinks a college fund is an unnecessary expense. Camilla's voice rose to the pitch that usually preceded tears. He wanted to use that money to invest in another startup. He said Sophia could get student loans like everyone else. My mother made appropriate horrified noises. What kind of father doesn't want to secure his daughter's educational future? I found myself wondering what kind of daughter doesn't tell her family that she's been fighting for her life, but I kept that observation to myself. Instead, I asked practical questions about legal strategy and offered reassuring comments about Camilla's character playing my assigned role in the family drama. The worst part, Camilla continued, is that this whole investigation is going to be public record. Anyone can look up our financial information. My entire life is going to be exposed because Derek is vindictive and his lawyer is aggressive. I almost laughed at her concern about privacy being violated. Camilla had documented every phase of her divorce on social media, from cryptic Instagram stories about choosing happiness to detailed Facebook posts about co-parenting challenges. She'd voluntarily made her private life public months ago, but pointing out that contradiction would only escalate the emotional temperature of the conversation. So I nodded sympathetically and made supportive noises about the injustice of Derek's legal tactics. "What I don't understand," my mother said, "is why his lawyer would pursue such an aggressive strategy. Surely they know that making Camilla look bad doesn't automatically make Derek look good in custody proceedings. It's about control," my father observed. "Derek probably feels powerless in other aspects of the divorce, so he's using the legal system to maintain some sense of influence over Camilla's choices." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They continued analyzing Derek's motivations and legal strategy while I sat quietly, marveling at how much intellectual and emotional energy my family could devote to understanding someone else's psychology. They'd spent months trying to decode Derek's behavior, researching custody law and strategizing responses to his various legal maneuvers. Meanwhile, I'd been making life or death medical decisions completely alone.
Isla, you're being unusually...
Quite again, my mother observed. Are you feeling all right? The question was so loaded with unintentional irony that I almost told them everything right then. I imagined their faces if I responded honestly. Actually, Mom, I've been undergoing chemotherapy for stage 2 lymphoma for the past 4 months, but I didn't want to interrupt Camilla's divorce crisis with my cancer drama. Instead, I said, I'm just processing everything. This is a lot to take in.
It really is, Camilla agreed,
settling onto the couch beside me with the exhausted sigh of someone who'd been carrying the weight of the world. I never imagined that getting divorced would be this complicated. You think you know someone after 7 years of marriage, and then they turn into a completely different person. I wanted to point out that people revealed their true characters under stress, not that they became different people. But Camilla had always preferred the narrative of betrayal and transformation to the messier reality of gradual disillusionment and incompatible values. The important thing, my father said with the tone of someone reaching a conclusion, is that we support each other through this difficult time. Family is what matters when everything else feels uncertain. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with cancer and everything to do with the cognitive dissonance of sitting in a room full of people talking about family support while none of them knew. I'd been facing the biggest crisis of my life without any family involvement. The meeting continued for another hour, covering practical details about upcoming court dates and emotional processing about the stress of prolonged legal proceedings. I contributed appropriately timed questions and comments, but part of me felt like I was watching the conversation from outside myself. When I finally drove home that night, I sat in my car for a long time before going upstairs to my apartment. The weight of my secret had become almost unbearable, but I still couldn't imagine a scenario where revealing my cancer diagnosis wouldn't feel like I was stealing attention from Camilla's legitimate crisis. Besides, what was the point of telling them now? According to Dr. Wong, I was going to survive. My prognosis was excellent. The cancer was responding to treatment. In a few months, this would all be over, and I could go back to being the easy daughter who never caused problems or demanded attention. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of my neighborhood settling into sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted during those months of medical secrecy. I'd learned to carry weight alone, to make decisions without input, to face fear without comfort. I'd learned to survive without my family, which raised uncomfortable questions about what family actually meant and whether survival was worth celebrating. If you had to do it in isolation, Thursday arrived with my usual pre-chemotherapy ritual. Light breakfast, comfortable clothes, a playlist of calming music, and the kind of mental preparation that people usually reserved for job interviews or first dates. After 4 months of treatment, I developed a routine that made the experience feel manageable, if not exactly pleasant. Gideon picked me up at 9:30, as he had for every appointment since my second session. That first time, I'd driven myself and spent the 3-hour infusion feeling isolated and sorry for myself while watching other patients surrounded by loving family members. Gideon had insisted on accompanying me after that, and his presence had transformed chemotherapy from an ordeal into something that felt almost like quality time. "How are you feeling about today?" he asked as we drove through morning traffic toward the cancer center. "Optimistic," I said, which was mostly true. Dr. Wong had indicated that this might be one of my final intensive treatments, depending on how my body responded over the next few weeks. "And grateful that you keep taking time off work to sit with me in medical waiting rooms. Gideon worked as a software developer for a Portland startup that specialized in apps for small businesses. His job offered the kind of flexibility that allowed him to disappear for half-day medical appointments without too many questions from his colleagues. I never asked what explanation he gave them for these regular absences, but I suspected he'd invented a convenient fiction that didn't involve his friend's cancer diagnosis. "I've been thinking," he said as we pulled into the parking garage, "about your family situation. What you're going to tell them when treatment is over." This was a conversation we'd been dancing around for weeks. Gideon thought I should have told my family about my diagnosis from the beginning. He'd made his opinion clear without being pushy about it, but I could tell he was growing more concerned about the psychological impact of maintaining such a significant secret.
"I'll figure it out," I said,
which was my standard response to questions about my family's ignorance regarding my medical situation. "Isla," he said gently, "they're going to notice eventually. You look different than you did 6 months ago. You're thinner, you're tired all the time, and you have a port in your chest. These aren't things you can hide indefinitely."
He was right, of course.
The physical changes from chemotherapy were becoming harder to disguise with makeup and clever clothing choices. I'd lost about 15 pounds, which my family would probably notice if they ever looked at me closely. My hair had thinned enough that I'd started wearing scarves and hats more frequently, and the port in my chest was visible as a small bump beneath my collarbone, obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. But my family had perfected the art of not looking too closely at anything that might complicate their existing narrative. Camilla was the dramatic one who required attention and support. I was the stable one who could handle whatever life threw at me without assistance. It was a dynamic that had served everyone's needs for decades, and changing it would require acknowledging that those needs had been fundamentally unequal. "Let's just focus on getting through today," I said, deflecting as usual. "We can worry about family dynamics after I'm officially in remission." The cancer center had become familiar territory over the past months. I knew which parking spots offered the most shade, which elevator moved fastest, and which reception desk staff members remembered patients' names. The building had been designed to feel welcoming and hopeful, with natural light and soothing colors and artwork that suggested recovery and renewal. But no amount of interior design could disguise the fact that it was a place where people came to fight for their lives. Nurse Diza greeted me with her usual combination of professionalism and warmth. She was a woman in her mid-40s who'd been working in oncology for over a decade, and she had the kind of steady presence that made patients feel safe even when everything else felt uncertain. "How are we feeling today, honey?" she asked as she led me to the infusion room. "Ready to be done with all this," I admitted. "I hear you," she said, preparing my four with practiced efficiency. "Dr. Wong mentioned that you might be transitioning to maintenance therapy soon. That's excellent news." The infusion room was designed to accommodate multiple patients receiving treatment simultaneously. Comfortable reclining chairs were arranged around the perimeter, each with its own small television and side table for personal belongings. Some patients came alone, reading books or sleeping through their treatment. Others brought family members who sat nearby, offering conversation and companionship during the long hours of waiting for medication to drip slowly into their bloodstream. I'd become friendly with several regular patients over the months. There was Margaret, a retired teacher in her 60s who brought crossword puzzles and always shared interesting facts she'd learned from NPR. Robert, a construction worker in his 40s who used treatment time to catch up on sports podcasts. And Sarah, a woman about my age who was being treated for breast cancer while raising twin toddlers. Sarah was the only person in the infusion room who'd ever asked about my family situation. "Do your parents live nearby?" She'd wondered during my third treatment session, about 20 minutes away. I told her, "That's nice. It must be helpful to have them close during treatment." I'd made non-committal noises and changed the subject to her children, but the conversation had stayed with me. Sarah's parents flew in from Chicago once a month to help with childcare during her treatment weeks. Her husband had rearranged his work schedule to be present for every medical appointment. Her in-laws brought meals and handled household maintenance. So she could focus on recovery. She was surrounded by a support network that rallied around her diagnosis like it was the most important thing happening in any of their lives. Because it was. Earth to Isla, Gideon's voice interrupted my reverie. He was sitting in the chair next to my recliner, his laptop open to what looked like code for a mobile app interface. You were staring at the ceiling with the most intense expression. What's going on in that head of yours? Just thinking about family dynamics, I said. How some people seem to naturally inspire support while others end up handling things alone. Gideon followed my gaze to Sarah, who was FaceTiming with her twins while her husband sat nearby, organizing her medications for the week ahead. "You know," he said carefully, "you could still change that dynamic. It's not too late to let your family be part of your recovery process. They're already overwhelmed with Camilla's situation," I said, adding my medical drama to their stress. Load feels selfish. Your cancer isn't drama, Ayla. It's a serious medical condition that you've been handling with incredible strength and grace. Your family should know that about you. Nurse Deja approached to check my vitals and adjust my flow rate. "How are you feeling, sweetie? Any nausea or discomfort?" "I'm okay," I said. "Maybe a little tired, but nothing unusual." "The fatigue should improve once you transition to maintenance therapy," she assured me. "Your body has been working hard to heal itself. You should be proud of how well you've tolerated treatment." After she moved on to check on other patients, Gideon returned to his earlier point. "Nurse Deja is right, you know. You've handled this entire experience with remarkable courage. Your family should have the opportunity to see that side of you." I wanted to argue that courage had nothing to do with it. I'd simply done what needed to be done the same way I approached every challenge in my life. But maybe that was exactly what courage looked like for some people. Not dramatic gestures or public declarations, but quiet persistence in the face of uncertainty. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Why do you think I've been so resistant to telling them?" Gideon considered the question seriously. "I think you're afraid they won't respond the way you need them to. And I think you're probably right to be afraid of that, based on everything you've told me about your family dynamics." His honesty was both comforting and unsettling. I'd been telling myself that I was protecting my family from additional stress, but the truth was more complicated. I was protecting myself from the possibility of needing support and not receiving it. As long as I didn't ask for help, I couldn't be disappointed by their failure to provide it. "But here's the thing," Gideon continued. "They might surprise you. People are capable of rising to occasions when they understand the stakes. And even if they don't respond perfectly, you'll know that you gave them the chance to be part of your life during a time when you really needed them." I watched Sarah say goodbye to her children and settle back in her chair for the remainder of her treatment. Her husband pulled out a book and began reading aloud to her something about a woman who inherited a bookstore in a small coastal town. Sarah closed her eyes and smiled as he narrated the story. Clearly familiar with this routine of shared entertainment during long medical procedures, it looked so simple, the way they'd integrated cancer treatment into their shared life. They'd made space for the illness without letting it consume everything else. They'd found ways to make medical appointments feel like just another kind of time together. I wondered what it would feel like to have someone read to me during chemotherapy. to look forward to treatment days because they meant uninterrupted time with a person I loved. I wondered what it would feel like to share the burden of medical decisions and appointment scheduling and insurance paperwork. But mostly, I wondered whether I'd waited too long to find out. The rest of my treatment passed quietly. Gideon worked on his laptop while I dozed intermittently, waking occasionally to sip water or adjust my position in the recliner. The medication dripped steadily into my bloodstream, carrying with it the promise of healing and the possibility of a future without cancer by the time we were ready to leave. I felt the familiar combination of exhaustion and relief that followed. Every session. My body was tired from processing the chemotherapy drugs, but my mind felt clearer than it had in weeks. "Do you want to grab lunch?" Gideon asked as we walked to his car. "That new Vietnamese place opened near your apartment." "Actually," I said, surprising myself with the decision, "I think I want to go see my family." Gideon stopped walking and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Are you planning to tell them?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I think I'm ready to find out." We drove toward my parents' house in comfortable silence, both of us probably wondering what I would say when I arrived and whether this impulsive decision would turn out to be wisdom or just post-chemotherapy emotional volatility. But for the first time in months, the secret felt heavier than the fear of sharing it. And that shift, small as it was, felt like the beginning of something that might eventually resemble courage. I stood on my parents' front porch for nearly 10 minutes before ringing the doorbell, rehearsing different versions of the conversation I was about to have. "Hi, I've been meaning to tell you that I have cancer." Too casual. "I need to share some medical news with you." Too clinical. "Remember how I said I was cutting back on work to focus on my portfolio? Well, actually, I've been undergoing chemotherapy." Too complicated. The truth was that there was no good way to tell your family that you'd been fighting cancer in secret for 4 months. Any version of that conversation was going to be awkward and painful and probably result in hurt feelings on multiple sides. That my mother answered the door wearing gardening clothes and a surprised expression. "Isla, what a nice surprise." "I wasn't expecting you until this weekend for Sophia's game." "Is everyone home?" I asked. "I was hoping we could talk as a family." Her expression immediately shifted to concern. "Is everything all right? You look pale." I almost laughed at that observation. I'd been pale for months, but this was the first time anyone in my family had noticed. Then again, my mother was seeing me in natural afternoon light instead of the carefully controlled lighting of restaurants and their living room, and I hadn't had time to apply my usual concealer and blush routine. "Everyone's here," she said, ushering me inside. "Your father's in his study, and Camilla brought Sophia over for the afternoon while she runs errands. Perfect timing for a family gathering." I could hear my niece's laughter coming from the backyard, where she was probably playing on the swing set my father had installed when she was 3. Camilla's voice carried through the kitchen window as she talked on the phone, likely with her attorney or another member of her divorce support network. My mother called everyone inside with the kind of authoritative tone she perfected during years of managing family logistics. Within minutes, we were all assembled in the living room, my parents on their usual spots on the couch, Camilla in the armchair she'd claimed as her own during childhood, and Sophia cross-legged on the floor with a coloring book. "Isla has something she wants to discuss with us," my mother announced. As if I were about to present a school project or announce an engagement, I looked around the room at these people who knew me better than anyone else in the world. Yet, somehow, didn't know the most important thing that had happened to me in years. Sophia was coloring a unicorn with intense concentration. Camilla was checking her phone while half listening to whatever announcement I was about to make. My parents sat with matching expressions of polite attention, waiting for me to explain why I'd called this impromptu family meeting. "I've been wanting to tell you all something for a while now," I began, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. But the timing never seemed right, and I didn't want to add stress to everything else that's been happening. Camilla looked up from her phone. "Are you moving? Please don't tell me you're leaving Portland. I can't handle any more major life changes right now." "I'm not moving," I said, "but I have been dealing with a health issue that I should have told you about sooner." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. My father leaned forward slightly, his academic training kicking in as he prepared to process new information. My mother's hand went to her throat in the unconscious gesture she made whenever she anticipated bad news. "What kind of health issue?" my mother asked, her voice carefully controlled. I took a deep breath and committed to the truth. "I was diagnosed with stage 2 lymphoma in March. I've been undergoing chemotherapy for the past 4 months, and my prognosis is excellent. My oncologist says I'm responding very well to treatment." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Sophia continued coloring, oblivious to the gravity of what I'd just revealed. My parents stared at me with expressions of shock and confusion. Camilla's mouth fell open slightly, her phone forgotten in her lap. "Cancer?" my mother whispered, as if saying the word too loudly might make it more real. "Lymphoma?" I clarified. "It's a cancer of the lymphatic system. But the important thing is that it's very treatable, especially when caught early like mine was. I'll probably transition to maintenance therapy within the next few weeks." My father was the first to find his voice. "When you say you've been undergoing chemotherapy for 4 months, do you mean since March? You've been dealing with this since March and didn't tell us?" There was hurt in his voice underneath the confusion, and I realized that my decision to keep my diagnosis secret had been as much about protecting myself from their potential reactions as it had been about protecting them from additional stress. "I wanted to tell you," I said. "But when I first got the diagnosis, Camilla had just announced her separation, and everyone was already dealing with so much emotional upheaval. I thought it would be better to handle the treatment privately until I knew more about my prognosis." "Better for who?" Camilla asked, and there was something sharp in her tone that I couldn't quite identify. "You thought it would be better to go through cancer treatment alone rather than let your family support you?" I was surprised by the intensity of her reaction. I'd expected confusion, maybe some guilt about being so absorbed in her own crisis, that she'd missed my medical emergency. But Camilla sounded almost angry, which wasn't the response I'd anticipated. "I wasn't completely alone," I said. "My friend Gideon has been incredibly supportive. He's driven me to appointments and helped with practical things when I wasn't feeling well." "Your friend Gideon knew about your cancer before your family did?" My mother's voice cracked slightly on the question. This was the part of the conversation I'd been dreading most. "Yes, I told a friend before telling my family." "Yes." I'd accepted support from someone outside our immediate circle while deliberately withholding information from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. When stated plainly, my choices sounded selfish and hurtful in ways I hadn't fully considered. "I told Gideon because I needed someone to drive me to my first oncology appointment," I explained. "And they just became part of my support system naturally. It wasn't a deliberate choice to exclude you all. It was more like I kept waiting for the right moment to have this conversation, and that moment never seemed to come." Sophia looked up from her coloring book, apparently sensing the emotional tension in the room, even if she didn't understand its cause. "And Isla, are you sick?" The innocence of her question cut through the adult complications like a knife. Here was a 6-year-old who could ask directly about what mattered, while the rest of us got tangled up in layers of hurt feelings and missed opportunities. I was sick, I told her, kneeling down to her level, but the doctors gave me medicine. That made me better. I'm going to be okay. Like when I had strep throat and had to take the pink medicine? Sort of like that, I agreed, except the medicine I took was stronger and it took longer to work. Sophia nodded with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children brought to information that terrified adults. I'm glad you're better now, she said, and returned to coloring her unicorn. When I stood up, my family was still staring at me with varying expressions of shock and hurt. My mother looked like she was trying not to cry. My father appeared to be processing the information with the methodical approach he brought to academic problems. Camilla looked angry and confused and possibly guilty, though she was doing her best to hide the latter. I don't understand, my mother said finally. How could you go through something like this without telling us? How could you sit through family dinners and pretend everything was normal when you were fighting cancer? The question revealed the fundamental disconnect between how I'd experienced the past few months and how they were interpreting my choices. From my perspective, I'd been protecting them from additional stress during an already difficult time. From their perspective, I'd been lying by omission and denying them the opportunity to support me when I needed them most. I thought I was being considerate, I said. Camilla was dealing with a divorce. You and Dad were worried about her and Sophia, and I didn't want to add another crisis to an already overwhelming situation. So you decided that your cancer wasn't as important as my divorce? Camilla's voice was sharp with something that sounded like offense. That's not what I meant, I said quickly. I never thought of it in terms of importance. I just thought about what everyone could handle emotionally, and it seemed like telling you about my diagnosis would create more problems than it would solve. That wasn't your decision to make, my father said quietly. You robbed us of the opportunity to be your family during one of the most difficult experiences of your life. His words hit harder than I'd expected because they reframed my choice in terms I hadn't considered. I'd been so focused on avoiding additional family drama that I overlooked the possibility that my family might actually want to help me, even if they were already dealing with other challenges. You're right, I admitted. I should have told you from the beginning. I was scared about how you'd react, and I was worried about adding stress to everything else that was happening, but those were my fears and my assumptions. I should have given you the chance to decide for yourselves how to respond. My mother stood up abruptly and walked to the window overlooking their backyard. I keep thinking about all the conversations we've had over the past few months, she said without turning around. All the times you seemed tired or distracted, and I attributed it to work stress or just being young and busy. I should have noticed that something was seriously wrong. Mom, there's no way you could have known, I said. I was deliberately hiding it from you. But that's exactly the problem, she said, turning back to face me. Why did you feel like you had to hide something like this from your family? What did we do wrong that made you think we wouldn't be there for you when you needed us most? This was the question I'd been avoiding for months, because answering it honestly would require acknowledging some uncomfortable truths about our family dynamics. But sitting in their living room, looking at their hurt and confused faces, I realized that continuing to protect them from difficult conversations wasn't actually protecting anyone. It's not that I thought you wouldn't be there for me, I said carefully. It's that I knew you were already there for Camilla, and I didn't think there was room for two family crises at the same time. Camilla made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. So this is my fault? You didn't tell the family about your cancer because my divorce was taking up too much space? That's not what I'm saying, I replied, though part of me wondered if it was exactly what I was saying. I'm trying to explain my thought process, not assign blame to anyone. But your thought process was based on the assumption that our family can only handle one person's problems at a time.
My father
Observed with the kind of analytical precision that made him an excellent professor and sometimes a frustrating parent.
Isn't that how it's always worked?
I asked, surprised by my own boldness. Camilla needed extra support during college because she was struggling academically. Camilla needed extra attention during her engagement because wedding planning was
Stressful.
Camilla needed the family to rally around her when she got pregnant because Derek wasn't being supportive enough. And now Camilla needs everyone focused on her divorce because it's complicated and emotionally difficult. I paused, realizing that I'd just articulated a pattern that had been invisible to me until I said it out loud. I've spent my entire adult life watching this family mobilize around Camilla's crises while I handled my own problems independently. So when I got cancer, it never occurred to me that the family dynamic might change to accommodate my needs too. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different.
Less shocked, more thoughtful.
Like everyone was processing not just my cancer diagnosis, but the family patterns that had made my secrecy feel necessary. Camilla was the first to speak. I had no idea you felt that way about our family, she said quietly. I never meant to monopolize everyone's attention. You didn't monopolize it, I said. You just needed it more than I did, or at least that's what we all believed. And maybe it was true for a long time. But when I got sick, I needed it too. And I didn't know
How to ask for it.
My mother returned to her seat on the couch, looking older than she had an hour earlier. We failed you, she said simply. Not just in the past few months, but for years. We let you become invisible because you made it easy for us to focus on Camilla's problems instead of paying attention to your needs.
I don't think anyone failed.
Anyone? I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed that. I think we all just fell into patterns that worked for a while until they didn't work anymore. Sophia had finished coloring her unicorn and moved on to a castle with elaborate turrets and flags. She was humming quietly to herself, creating a soundtrack of innocence that provided strange comfort during this difficult conversation. What happens now? My father asked. With your treatment, I mean. What do you need from us going forward? It was such a practical question, so focused on solutions rather than blame, that I felt myself relax slightly for the first time since I'd arrived. I have a few more appointments with my oncologist to finalize the transition to maintenance therapy. After that, it's mostly monitoring and checkups to make sure the cancer doesn't return. I want to come to your next appointment, my mother said firmly. I want to meet your doctor and understand your treatment plan and ask whatever questions I should have been asking for the past 4 months. I'd like that, I said, and realized I meant it. The prospect of having family support during medical appointments felt both terrifying and potentially wonderful. And I want to know what we can do to help with practical things, my father added. Meals, transportation, household tasks, whatever would make your recovery easier. Camilla had been quiet for several minutes, staring at her hands with an expression I couldn't read. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I'm sorry, she said. Not just for not knowing about your cancer, but for being so absorbed in my own problems that you felt like there wasn't room for yours. That's not the kind of sister I want to be. You're not responsible for my choices, I told her. I should have trusted you all to handle multiple challenges at once. I should have given you the chance to show up for me the way you've shown up for each other during difficult times. But I am responsible for creating a family dynamic where you felt like you had to choose between my needs and yours, Camilla said. And I want to figure out how to change that going forward. The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical details about my treatment schedule and emotional processing about the months of secrecy that I kept us all apart during a time when we should have been supporting each other. By the time I left my parents' house, I felt lighter than I had in months, not because the cancer was gone, though my prognosis remained excellent, but because the weight of keeping such a significant secret had finally been lifted. My family knew the truth about what I'd been facing, and they wanted to be part of my recovery process. It wasn't a perfect resolution to months of complicated family dynamics, but it was a beginning. And for the first time since my diagnosis, beginning felt like enough. 3 weeks after my family confession, I was sitting in Dr. Wong's office receiving news that changed everything. I thought I understood about my cancer diagnosis and treatment. The routine blood work that was supposed to confirm my transition to maintenance therapy had revealed something unexpected, something that recontextualized every conversation I'd had with my family about my medical secrecy. I need to be completely transparent with you about what we're seeing in your latest test results, Dr. Wong said, her usual calm demeanor tinged with something that looked like concern. Your lymphoma has developed resistance to the current chemotherapy protocol. The words hit me like physical blows. Resistance?
What does that mean exactly?
It means the cancer cells have adapted to medications we've been using, and they're no longer responding as effectively to treatment. This happens in approximately 15% of lymphoma cases at your stage. I stared at her, trying to process this information that seemed to contradict everything she told me just a few weeks earlier. But you said my prognosis was excellent. You said the tumors were shrinking and I was responding well to treatment. That was all true based on the information we had at the time, Dr. Wong explained. Cancer is unfortunately unpredictable, and cells can develop resistance to treatment even when initial responses are very positive. She pulled up new skin images on her computer screen, pointing to areas where the tumors had not only stopped shrinking, but appeared to be growing again. The abstract swirls of gray and white that had previously told a story of healing now revealed a different narrative entirely. What does this mean for my treatment plan? I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. We need to switch to a more aggressive protocol, she said. There are several second-line treatment options available, but they typically involve higher doses of chemotherapy and potentially radiation therapy. The good news is that many patients respond very well to these alternative approaches. The room felt like it was spinning slightly. For months, I'd been telling myself that keeping my diagnosis secret was justified because my prognosis was good, and the treatment was manageable. I've been preparing to transition to simple maintenance therapy and eventually put cancer behind me entirely. Now, I was facing the possibility of more intensive treatment, more severe side effects, and a less certain outcome. How much more time are we talking about? I asked. Weeks? Months? It's difficult to predict exactly, but second-line treatment protocols typically run 6 to 8 months, followed by ongoing monitoring. We'll know more about how you're responding after the first few cycles. Dr. Wong continued explaining the details of various treatment options, but I found it hard to focus on the medical terminology and statistical probabilities. All I could think about was how I was going to tell my family that the cancer situation they just learned about was actually much more serious than I led them to believe. Dr. Wong, I interrupted, when you say second-line treatment is more aggressive, what exactly does that mean in terms of side effects and recovery time? She paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. The medications we'll be using are more potent, which means you'll likely experience increased fatigue, nausea, and immune system suppression. Many patients require temporary breaks from work. or other activities during the most intensive phases of treatment. The practical implications of this news began to cascade through my mind. I'd already been struggling to maintain my freelance design work during the supposedly manageable phase of treatment. More aggressive chemotherapy would probably make it impossible to meet client deadlines or take on new projects, which meant I'd need financial support from my family at exactly the moment when they were still processing the revelation that I'd been hiding my original diagnosis from them. I'd like to schedule your first appointment for the new protocol as soon as possible, Dr. Wong continued. Time is a factor when we're dealing with resistant cancer cells. I agreed to the appointment scheduling and accepted the stack of informational pamphlets about second-line lymphoma treatment, but I felt like I was moving through thick fog. Nothing about this conversation aligned with the careful narrative I'd constructed about my cancer being a temporary disruption that I could handle. Independently, when I left the medical center, I sat in my car for 20 minutes before calling Gideon. His phone went straight to voicemail, which meant he was probably in meetings and wouldn't be available for several hours. The thought of sitting alone with this news until evening felt unbearable. Instead, I drove to my parents' house, my mother answered the door wearing the kind of concerned expression that had become her default setting since learning about my diagnosis.
Isla, I wasn't expecting you today.
How did your appointment go? Is everyone home? I asked, experiencing deja vu from my previous impromptu family visit. I need to talk to everyone again. Her face went pale.
Oh no. What did the doctor
say? 20 minutes later, I was once again sitting in my parents' living room, preparing to deliver news that would append my family's understanding of my medical situation. This time, Sophia wasn't present. Camilla had arranged for her to spend the afternoon with Derek, which meant we could speak more directly about the serious implications of my diagnosis. The cancer isn't responding to treatment the way my doctor expected, I began, deciding to lead with the basic facts before getting into the complicated details. I need to start a more aggressive chemotherapy protocol, which means my treatment is going to continue for several more months. The silence that followed felt familiar, but heavier this time. My parents exchanged the kind of wordless communication that couples developed after decades of marriage, each reading volumes into the other's expression. When you say more aggressive, my father asked carefully, what specifically does that involve? I explained what Dr. Wong had told me about second-line treatment protocols, higher medication doses, and increased side effects. I tried to present the information in the same calm, clinical tone she'd used, but my voice shook when I described the possibility of needing to take extended breaks from work. So, when you told us 3 weeks ago that your prognosis was excellent, Camilla said, slowly, that wasn't actually the complete picture. It was the complete picture based on what we knew at the time, I said, echoing Dr. Wong's explanation. But cancer is unpredictable, and cells can develop resistance to treatment even when initial responses look positive.
Isla, my mother
said gently, I need to ask you something directly. How serious is this? Are we talking about a temporary setback in your recovery, or are we talking about a life-threatening situation? It was the question I'd been avoiding asking myself, let alone my doctor. Dr. Wong had focused on treatment options and statistical probabilities rather than worst-case scenarios, but the subtext of our conversation had been clear enough.
Doctor
Wong says that most patients respond well to second-line treatments, I said carefully. But she also emphasized the importance of starting the new protocol quickly, which suggests that time is a factor. My father leaned forward, his academic training compelling him to analyze the implications of what I just revealed. Isla, I think what your mother is asking, what we're all wondering, is whether you're still confident about your long-term survival. The directness of his question forced me to confront the fear I'd been suppressing since leaving Dr. Wang's office. For months, I'd operated under the assumption that cancer was a temporary disruption in my life rather than a potential threat to my future. Now I was facing the possibility that my original optimism had been premature. I don't know, I admitted. I was confident 3 weeks ago, but everything changed today. I won't know how the new treatment is working until I've completed several cycles, and even then there are no guarantees. Camilla stood up abruptly and began pacing in front of the fireplace, a gesture I recognized from our childhood when she was trying to process overwhelming information. "I can't believe this is happening," she said. "I can't believe you're dealing with something this serious, and we just found out about it." "I'm sorry," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was apologizing for. "I know the timing of this. News is terrible, especially when you're already dealing with so much stress from the divorce." Camilla stopped pacing and stared at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Isla, do you honestly think I care about my divorce drama when my sister might be dying of cancer?" The bluntness of her statement hit me like a physical blow. Dying. It was the word none of us had spoken aloud, but it had been hovering at the edges of every conversation since my diagnosis. "I'm not dying," I said quickly, though I wasn't entirely certain that was true anymore. "The treatment options are good. Dr. Wang is optimistic about second-line protocols." "But you just said there are no guarantees," my father pointed out with the logical precision that sometimes made difficult conversations even more difficult. "There are never guarantees with cancer," I said. "But that doesn't mean the outcome is predetermined. It just means we have to take things one step at a time and hope for the best." My mother had been quiet throughout this exchange, but now she stood and walked to where I was sitting. Without saying anything, she pulled me into the kind of fierce hug that mothers give their children when words aren't adequate to express what they're feeling. "We're going to get through this together," she said into my hair. "Whatever happens next, you're not handling it alone anymore." I felt tears threatening for the first time since leaving Dr. Wang's office. Not tears of sadness, exactly, but tears of relief at finally having people who wanted to share the burden of uncertainty and fear that I'd been carrying by myself for months. "I need to tell you something else," I said when my mother released me from the hug. "The new treatment protocol is going to be more expensive than what I've been doing, and I'll probably need to take significant time off from work. I might need financial help from the family." This was the admission that had been almost as difficult as revealing my diagnosis. I'd spent my entire adult life priding myself on financial independence, and asking for money felt like acknowledging failure in multiple areas of my life simultaneously. "Of course we'll help with expenses," my father said immediately. "Medical bills, living expenses, whatever you need. You shouldn't have to worry about money while you're fighting cancer." "And I want to help too," Camilla added. "I know my financial situation is complicated right now because of the divorce, but I have some savings that aren't tied up in legal proceedings. Please let me contribute to your medical expenses." I was surprised by her offer, particularly given how absorbed she'd been in her own financial anxieties related to the divorce settlement. But there was something genuine in her expression that reminded me of the sister I'd grown up with, before family dynamics had become so complicated by competing needs and unequal attention. "Thank you," I said. "Both of you. I've been dreading this conversation because I was afraid of becoming a burden when everyone already has so much to deal with." "You're not a burden," my mother said firmly. "You're our daughter and sister, and helping you through this crisis is exactly what families are supposed to do." The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical details about treatment scheduling and financial planning. By the time I left my parents' house, I had a folder full of insurance paperwork that my father had offered to manage and a detailed list of meal preferences that my mother was planning to use for weekly dinner deliveries. But more importantly, I had the beginning of a support system that felt capable of handling whatever challenges the next phase of treatment might bring. As I drove home, I thought about how different this conversation had been from my first cancer revelation 3 weeks earlier. The news had been more serious this time, but the family response had been more immediate and practical. Maybe because they'd already processed the shock of my diagnosis. Or maybe because the gravity of the situation made emotional drama feel irrelevant. Whatever the reason, I felt more hopeful about my family's ability to support me through the difficult months ahead than I had about anything else since receiving my original cancer diagnosis. It wasn't the outcome I planned for, but it was the outcome I needed. And for the first time in months, that felt like enough. The new chemotherapy protocol began 2 weeks later with a pre-treatment consultation that my mother insisted on attending. I'd expected her presence to feel intrusive or overwhelming, but instead it was deeply comforting to have someone else ask the practical questions I'd been too overwhelmed to formulate. What specific side effects should we watch for at home? She asked Dr. Wong, pulling out a small notebook where she'd apparently been recording medical information since learning about my diagnosis. How will we know if the treatment is working? My father added. He'd driven separately from work and arrived wearing the slightly rumpled suit that made him look like the professor he was. Even Camilla had come, despite having a mediation session scheduled for later that afternoon. She sat quietly in the corner of the examination room, occasionally taking notes on her phone, but mostly just observing the medical conversation with the focused attention she usually reserved for legal strategies. Dr. Wong patiently answered their questions and provided additional resources for family members supporting cancer patients. She explained warning signs that would require immediate medical attention and gave them her direct contact information for emergencies. The most important thing, she told my parents, is that Isla doesn't try to minimize symptoms or push through side effects without telling us. The medications we're using are more potent than her previous protocol, and we need to monitor her response very carefully. I felt a pang of guilt as she spoke, knowing that my tendency to downplay medical issues had probably contributed to my family's confusion about the seriousness of my condition. I'd spent months describing chemotherapy as manageable and not too bad, when the reality had been more complicated. "We understand," my mother said with the kind of authority that suggested she'd been researching cancer care extensively since our last family meeting. "We'll make sure she communicates honestly about how she's feeling." After the consultation, we went to the infusion center where Nurse Deja greeted my family with genuine warmth. "I'm so glad to finally meet Isla's people," she said, which made me realize that she'd probably been concerned about my apparent lack of family support during previous treatments. "We're sorry it took us so long to get here," my father said with characteristic directness. "We only recently learned about Isla's diagnosis." If Nurse Deja was surprised by this information, she didn't show it. "The important thing is that you're here now," she said simply. Family support makes a huge difference in treatment outcomes. The first session of the new protocol lasted nearly 6 hours, significantly longer than my previous treatments. My family rotated through visiting shifts, with my mother staying for most of the day while my father and Camilla handled work obligations and returned in the afternoon. I'd worried that having family members present would make the treatment feel more dramatic or frightening, but instead their presence made the experience feel more normal. My mother brought crossword puzzles and read magazine articles aloud when I was too tired to focus on anything complex. My father used the quiet time to grade student papers, occasionally sharing amusing excerpts from freshman essays about literature. Camilla surprised me by being the most natural at the bedside conversation that helped pass the long hours of treatment. She told funny stories about Sophia's latest adventures in kindergarten and shared updates about mutual friends from high school. She avoided mentioning her divorce entirely, which I appreciated since I was struggling with enough medical anxiety. Without worrying about family drama. "How are you feeling?" she asked during a quiet moment when our parents had gone to get coffee. "Tired," I admitted, and scared about how much worse the side effects might be with the stronger medication. "Are you scared about anything else?" she asked gently. It was the kind of direct emotional question that Camilla rarely asked, and I found myself considering it seriously. "I'm scared that I waited too long to tell you all about the cancer, and now there might not be enough time to make up for those months when I was handling everything alone." Camilla was quiet for a moment, processing what I'd said. "Isla, can I tell you something that I've been thinking about since you first told us about your diagnosis?" I nodded, curious about what perspective she might offer. "I've been so angry at myself for being so self-absorbed that I missed the fact that my sister was fighting cancer," she said. "But I've also been thinking about why you felt like you couldn't tell us. And I keep coming back to the fact that our family has never been good at handling multiple crises simultaneously." This was a more insightful observation than I'd expected. From Camilla, who typically focused on immediate emotional responses rather than systemic family patterns. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean that you were probably right to assume that there wasn't room for your cancer and my divorce in the family attention span at the same time," she said. "Not because your cancer wasn't important, but because we've never learned how to distribute emotional support evenly when multiple people need help." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I've been the dramatic one for so long that everyone, including me, assumed that meant I needed the most support. But that assumption was probably unfair to you, especially when you were facing something genuinely life-threatening." I was touched by her willingness to examine our family dynamics critically, particularly at a moment when she had every right to be focused on her own stress and uncertainty. "I don't think anyone meant for things to work out that way," I said. "It's just the pattern we fell into over the years." "But patterns can change," Camilla said. "And I want ours to change, starting now. I want you to know that your medical situation is the family priority, and my divorce drama can take a back seat until you're healthy again. You don't have to put your life on hold because I have cancer," I protested. "I'm not putting my life on hold," she clarified. "I'm just reorganizing my priorities so that supporting my sister through cancer treatment is more important than strategizing custody. Arrangements are processing emotional drama about Derek's behavior." When my parents returned with coffee, they found us having the kind of honest conversation that had been rare in our family for years. My mother looked pleased, but didn't comment directly, which I appreciated since drawing attention to the moment might have made it feel forced rather than natural. The rest of the treatment session passed more easily than I'd expected. Having my family present didn't eliminate the physical discomfort of chemotherapy, but it transformed the experience from something I endured alone into something we were managing together. By the time we were ready to leave the cancer center, I felt exhausted but not devastated. The new medications had been harder on my system than the previous protocol, but having 3 people available to drive me home, prepare dinner, and handle practical tasks made the aftermath feel manageable. That evening, my parents stayed at my apartment to monitor my response to the new treatment. My mother made soup and insisted I try to eat small amounts throughout the evening. My father researched side effect management strategies and created a schedule for medication and symptom tracking. Camilla picked up Sophia from Derek's house and brought her over for a brief visit, explaining that Aunt Isla was taking strong medicine that made her tired but would help her get better. Sophia accepted this information with the straightforward logic of childhood and presented me with a drawing of a superhero that she'd made at school. "This is you," she explained, pointing to a figure with cape and mask. "You're fighting the bad guys in your body." It was such a perfect metaphor for cancer treatment that I almost cried. Instead, I thanked her for the drawing and promised to hang it on my refrigerator where I could see it every day. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and I was lying in bed feeling the full impact of the new chemotherapy protocol, I realized that this was what I'd been afraid of losing by keeping my diagnosis secret. Not just practical support during medical crises, but the ordinary intimacy of family members who wanted to take care of each other during difficult times. I had spent months protecting my independence, when what I actually needed was interdependence. The knowledge that other people cared enough about my well-being to rearrange their schedules, research treatment options, and sit with me during long medical appointments. The next morning, I woke up feeling more nauseated than I had after any previous treatment. But I also woke up to text messages from all 3 family members checking on how I'd slept and whether I needed anything before they started their workdays. It was a small thing, but it represented a fundamental shift in how we were approaching my medical situation. Instead of me managing cancer as a private challenge while participating in family life as if nothing had changed, we were all adjusting our routines to accommodate the reality of serious illness and intensive treatment. For the first time since my diagnosis, I felt like cancer was something that was happening to our family, not just something that was happening to me. And that shift, subtle as it was, made everything else feel more bearable. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I was no longer traveling it alone. And after months of isolation, that felt like its own kind of healing. 6 weeks into the new treatment protocol, I received news that changed everything once again. Dr. Wong called me personally on a Friday afternoon while I was lying on my couch, recovering from my latest chemotherapy session and trying to work up the energy to eat the soup my mother had delivered that morning. "Isla, I wanted to share your latest scan results with you directly," she said, and there was something in her voice that made me sit up straighter despite my fatigue. "The new treatment protocol is working beautifully. Your tumors have shrunk significantly, and your blood work shows excellent improvement across all markers." I stared at the ceiling of my apartment, trying to process this information that seemed almost too good to believe. "Are you saying the cancer is responding to the second-line treatment?" "I'm saying the cancer is responding better than we dared to hope," she replied. "If this trend continues, we'll be able to transition you to maintenance therapy much sooner than originally projected. I'm cautiously optimistic that you'll be in remission within the next few months." The word remission hit me like a physical force. After weeks of uncertainty and escalating medical interventions, the possibility of recovery felt almost surreal. "What does this mean for my treatment schedule?" I asked. "We'll continue with the current protocol for another month to ensure the response is stable," Dr. Wong explained. "Then we'll gradually reduce the intensity while monitoring your progress closely. But Isla, these results suggest that you're going to have a full recovery." After we hung up, I sat on my couch for nearly an hour, staring at my phone and trying to absorb the magnitude of what I'd just learned. Not only was I likely to survive cancer, but I was going to survive it with the support of my family, who had rallied around me once they understood the gravity of my situation. The irony wasn't lost on me that my decision to finally tell my family about my diagnosis had coincided with my cancer developing treatment resistance, which had led to them understanding the true seriousness of my condition, which had resulted in the kind of support I needed all along. I called my mother first. "Doctor, Wong just called with my latest scan results," I said as soon as she answered. "The new treatment is working. The tumors are shrinking rapidly, and she thinks I'll be in remission within a few months." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then I heard my mother crying, not the careful, controlled tears she'd been managing during my treatment, but the deep, relieved sobs of someone who'd been holding their breath for weeks. "Oh, honey," she managed to say between tears. "That's the most wonderful news I've heard in months." "I wanted you to be the first to know," I said. "Can you tell Dad and Camilla?" "I'm still processing the information myself." "Of course," she said. "Should we come over? Do you want to celebrate?" I considered the offer, but realized that what I most wanted was time to absorb this news privately before it became a family event. "Maybe tomorrow?" "I think I need tonight to just sit with the relief." "I understand completely," my mother said. "But, Isla, I'm so proud of how you've handled this entire experience. Your strength and courage have been extraordinary." After we hung up, I called Gideon, who had remained my primary emotional support throughout the family integration process. He'd been quietly pleased when my parents and Camilla became involved in my care, but he'd also maintained his role as the person I could talk to about fears and doubts without worrying about managing their emotional responses. "The scans are good," I told him. "Really good. Dr. Wong thinks I'm going to make a full recovery." "Isla, that's incredible news," he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice too. "How are you feeling about it?" "Grateful," I said, "and a little overwhelmed. I keep thinking about how different this experience would have been if I'd told my family about the diagnosis from the beginning." "Do you regret waiting?" he asked. I considered the question seriously. "I regret the months when I felt isolated and scared, but I don't regret the way things ultimately worked out. My family rose to the occasion when they understood how serious the situation was. And maybe that wouldn't have happened if I'd presented cancer as a manageable inconvenience instead of a life-threatening crisis." "You think they needed to understand the stakes before they could provide the support you needed?" "I think our family dynamics had become so entrenched that it took something genuinely serious to shift them," I said. "And maybe my initial instinct to protect them from medical drama was actually protecting all of us from having to examine some uncomfortable patterns in how we distribute attention and care." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "That's a remarkably mature perspective on a situation that could have turned out very differently." "It did turn out differently," I pointed out. "Not the medical outcome, but the family outcome. We learned how to support each other through crisis, which is something we'd never really done before. That evening, I ordered Thai food from my favorite restaurant and settled onto my couch with a movie I'd been wanting to watch for months. For the first time since my diagnosis, I felt relaxed enough to focus on entertainment rather than medical anxiety or family dynamics. But as I ate pad thai and watched a romantic comedy about a woman starting over in a new city, I found myself thinking about what came next. Assuming my recovery continued on its current trajectory, I would soon transition from being a cancer patient to being a cancer survivor. My family would shift from crisis mode back to their normal routines. The intensive support system we developed would gradually become less necessary, which raised questions about what our family relationships would look like after cancer was no longer organizing our interactions. The next morning, my parents and Camilla arrived at my apartment with flowers, pastries, and the kind of celebratory energy that suggested they'd been planning this visit since my mother shared the good news. Sophia bounced into my living room wearing a t-shirt that said, "My aunt is a superhero," and carrying a card she'd made at school. "We brought champagne," Camilla announced, holding up a bottle of expensive-looking sparkling wine.
Mom said it
Was too early to drink, but I said good medical news is always worth celebrating. My father set down a bag of groceries. We also brought ingredients for your favorite breakfast. I thought we could cook together if you're feeling up to it.
I
Was touched by their enthusiasm and their obvious desire to mark this milestone in my recovery. But I was also aware that this might be our last crisis-centered family gathering, which gave the celebration a bittersweet quality. Before we opened the champagne, I said, I want to talk to you all about something. Their expressions immediately shifted to concern, probably anticipating more medical complications. Nothing bad, I assured them quickly. But I've been thinking about what happens to our family dynamic when I'm officially in remission and no longer need intensive support. My parents exchanged a glance that suggested they'd been having similar conversations. Camilla looked puzzled, as if she hadn't considered that my recovery might change anything beyond my health status. What do you mean? She asked. I mean that cancer brought out the best in our family, I said carefully. You all stepped up to provide emotional and practical support in ways that have been amazing. But I'm wondering whether we can maintain this level of mutual care and attention when there isn't a medical crisis organizing our interactions. My father nodded slowly. You're asking whether we've learned to be a different kind of family, or whether we've just temporarily adapted to extraordinary circumstances. Exactly, I said. And I'm hoping it's the former, because the family we've become during my treatment is the family I want us to remain. My mother sat down beside me on the couch. Isla, I think I can speak for all of us when I say that learning about your cancer forced us to examine some patterns in our family that needed changing. The way we distributed attention, the way we assumed you didn't need support because you seemed strong and independent. Those patterns were unfair to you long before you got sick. And I don't want to go back to those patterns, Camilla added. Not just because it wouldn't be fair to you, but because I've realized how much I missed by not paying closer attention to your life and needs. Plus, she continued with a slight smile, my divorce drama seems a lot less important after watching you fight cancer with such grace. It's given me perspective about what actually constitutes a crisis versus what's just ordinary life stress. I felt a surge of hope that maybe cancer had indeed catalyzed lasting changes in our family dynamics, rather than just temporary adjustments to extraordinary circumstances. So, what are you thinking? My father asked. How do we maintain the positive changes we've made without requiring ongoing medical emergencies to justify family support? Regular family dinners, I suggested. Not just for special occasions or crisis management, but as a way to stay connected to each other's daily lives. And actually listening when people share problems or concerns, my mother added. Instead of assuming that whoever speaks loudest or most dramatically needs the most. Help! And remembering that being strong and independent doesn't mean someone doesn't want emotional support sometimes. Camilla said, looking directly at me. We spent the rest of the morning cooking breakfast together and talking about practical ways to maintain the closeness we developed during my treatment. By the time we opened the champagne, it felt like we were celebrating not just my medical recovery, but our family's evolution into something more balanced and mutually supportive. That afternoon, after everyone had gone home, I sat in my living room surrounded by flowers and get well cards, thinking about how different my life looked compared to 6 months earlier. I was still recovering from cancer, but I was no longer facing it alone. My family had proven capable of rising to serious challenges when they understood the stakes. Most importantly, I'd learned that hiding problems to protect other people often ended up protecting no one. The courage to be vulnerable had transformed. Not just my medical experience, but my family relationships in ways that would extend far beyond cancer treatment. I pulled out my phone and composed a text to Dr. Wong. Thank you for everything. Not just the medical care, but for encouraging me to let my family be part of my recovery. It made all the difference. Her response came quickly. That's what families are for. I'm so glad you figured that out in time to enjoy it.
In time to
enjoy it. As I settled back on my couch with a cup of tea and the peaceful exhaustion that followed family celebrations, I realized that Dr. Wong was right. I had figured it out in time, not just to survive cancer, but to discover what my family was capable of when faced with something that truly mattered. And that discovery, as much as my medical recovery, felt worth celebrating. 8 months after my initial cancer diagnosis, I stood in the parking lot of the medical center, holding a folder containing my final scan results and an official letter confirming that I was in complete remission. Dr. Wong had hugged me during our appointment, the first time she'd shown such overt emotion during our professional relationship, and told me that my response to treatment had exceeded all expectations. You're officially a cancer survivor, she'd said, the words carrying weight that I was still trying to fully comprehend. My entire family had wanted to attend this appointment, but I'd asked to go alone. Not because I didn't want their support, but because I needed to process this milestone privately before it became a family celebration. The months of treatment had taught me to recognize when I needed solitude versus when I needed company. And this felt like a moment that required quiet reflection. I drove to the coffee shop where I'd often gone to decompress after medical appointments, claiming the same corner table where I'd sat so many times during treatment. But this time, instead of feeling exhausted and uncertain, I felt something approaching peace. My phone buzzed with a text from Gideon. How did the appointment go? Complete remission, I typed back. Officially cancer-free. His response came immediately. Isla, that's incredible. How are you feeling? I stared at his question, trying to articulate the complex mixture of relief, gratitude, and unexpected melancholy that I was experiencing. Grateful, I typed, and a little sad that this chapter is ending. It was a strange thing to admit, but the months of cancer treatment had been among the most meaningful of my life. Not because of the medical crisis itself, but because of how my family had responded to it. We'd learned to take care of each other in ways that had transformed our relationships fundamentally. Now that the crisis was over, I was afraid we might gradually drift back to our previous patterns of emotional distance and unequal attention distribution. My mother called as I was finishing my latte.
How did it go, honey? Are you okay?
The scans are clear, I told her. Dr. Wong says I'm officially in remission. I heard her take a sharp breath. Oh, Isla, that's wonderful news. We should celebrate properly this time.
I'd like that, I
said, but I also want to talk to everyone about what comes next. Not medically, but for our family. What do you mean? I mean that cancer brought out qualities in our family that I hope we don't lose now that the medical emergency is over.
I explained.
I want to make sure we keep taking care of each other even when there isn't a crisis requiring it. My mother was quiet for a moment. I've been worried about the same thing, she admitted. The past few months have reminded me what our family is capable of when we pay attention to each other's needs. I don't want to go back to taking those connections for granted. That evening, my family gathered at my parents' house for what had become our traditional post-appointment dinner. But this time, instead of discussing treatment schedules and side effect management, we were celebrating the end of active medical intervention. Camilla had brought champagne again, along with a cake decorated with the words "Cancer Survivor" in cheerful pink frosting. Sophia presented me with another superhero drawing, this one showing the caped figure standing victorious over a pile of defeated villains. The bad guys are all gone now, she explained with 6-year-old certainty.
You won.
Her simple summary of my cancer experience made me smile. From her perspective, I had indeed won a clear victory over identifiable enemies. The adult reality was more complicated. Cancer survival involved ongoing monitoring, lifestyle changes, and the psychological adjustment to living with the knowledge. That serious illness was always a possibility, but there was something appealing about Sophia's narrative of triumph over adversity.
I had fought cancer and won.
My family had rallied around me during the fight. We'd all learned something valuable about our capacity for mutual support during difficult times. Before we eat, I said, claiming everyone's attention, I want to talk about how we maintain the closeness we've developed during my treatment.
You mean you don't want us to go back to only seeing each other on holidays and birthdays?
Camilla asked with a teasing smile. Exactly, I said. I want us to stay connected to each other's daily lives, not just our major crises. We spent dinner discussing practical strategies for maintaining family closeness, regular weekly dinners, group text threads for sharing daily updates, and a commitment to ask for help when needed rather than assuming independence was always preferable. I've been thinking, my father said during dessert, about how cancer forced us to prioritize what actually matters. Family support, honest communication, being present for each other during difficult times. Those shouldn't be emergency-only values.
They shouldn't,
my mother agreed. And I think we all learned that supporting each other doesn't require sacrificing our individual lives. We can maintain our separate interests and responsibilities, while still being emotionally available when family members need us. Camilla nodded. Plus, I realized that I actually like being someone my sister can depend on. It felt good to be needed for something other than managing drama or processing emotional upheaval. This observation touched on something I noticed during my treatment, that having a genuine crisis to rally around had brought out generous, caring qualities in my family that had been overshadowed by years of focusing on less serious but more dramatic problems. There's something else I want to say, I continued. I'm grateful that you all forgave me for keeping my diagnosis secret initially. I know that choice caused hurt and confusion, and I'm sorry for making you feel excluded from something so important. You are protecting yourself, my mother said gently. And given our family dynamics at the time, you probably made a reasonable decision based on the information you had. But I'm glad you eventually trusted us with the truth, my father added. Even if the circumstances weren't ideal, getting to support you through treatment has been one of the most meaningful experiences of my life as a parent. Camilla was quiet for a moment before speaking. I keep thinking about how scared you must have been, handling cancer alone for all those months. And I feel terrible that I was so absorbed in my own problems that I didn't notice you were struggling. But you did notice, once you knew what to look for, I pointed out. And you responded beautifully. All of you did.
We rose to the occasion,
my mother observed, which suggests we were always capable of this level of mutual support. We just needed to understand that it was necessary.
After dinner, Camilla and I sat on the back porch while our parents cleaned up and Sophia played in the yard.
The October evening was cool but not uncomfortable, and the familiar sounds of our childhood neighborhood provided a peaceful backdrop for conversation. Can I ask you something? Camilla said. Do you think you would have told us about the cancer eventually, even if it hadn't developed treatment resistance? I considered her question seriously. I honestly don't know. I might have waited until after treatment was completely finished and then mentioned it casually, like it was something that happened rather than something I was actively going through. Why? Because I was afraid you all would see my cancer as competition for your attention and emotional energy, I admitted. And I was afraid you'd see me differently, as someone who needed care instead of someone who could provide it. Camilla was quiet for a while, watching Sophia chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. I think I've been afraid of the opposite thing, she said finally. Afraid that people would stop seeing me as someone worth caring about if I wasn't dramatic enough or needy enough to hold their attention. This was a more insightful observation than I'd expected from my sister, and it highlighted how our family dynamics had shaped both of our approaches to seeking support. Maybe we were both wrong about what it takes to deserve care and attention. I suggested. Maybe, she agreed. Or maybe we just needed to learn that love isn't a finite resource that has to be rationed among family members. As we drove home that night, I reflected on how much had changed since my diagnosis 8 months. Earlier, I was no longer just the quiet, independent daughter who handled problems alone. My family was no longer a collection of individuals who happened to share DNA and holiday dinners. We'd become something more intentional and mutual. A group of people who had chosen to take care of each other not just during emergencies, but as an ongoing commitment. The transformation hadn't been easy, and it had required a serious medical crisis to catalyze changes that probably should have happened years earlier. But the outcome felt like something worth the difficult journey. 3 months later, at our first post-remission holiday gathering, I watched my family interact with a kind of natural affection and attention that had once felt impossible to imagine. Camilla asked thoughtful questions about my work projects. My parents remembered details about my daily life without needing medical appointments to focus their attention. Everyone shared both good news and concerns without competing for priority. Status. We'd learned to be a family that could handle multiple people's needs simultaneously, that could provide support without requiring crisis-level drama to justify care, and that could maintain individual independence while still being interdependent when circumstances required it. Cancer had been the worst thing that ever happened to me, and it had also been the catalyst for the best transformation in my family relationships. Both things could be true simultaneously, which seemed like a fitting metaphor for the complexity of survival itself. As I sat at my parents' dining table, surrounded by people who had learned to see me clearly and love me completely, I realized that cancer had taught me something essential about the difference between surviving alone and surviving together. Both were possible, but only one felt like truly living. And for the first time in my adult life, I was doing both, surviving and living independently and interdependently, with the knowledge that my family would be there for whatever challenges lay ahead. It was a kind of security I'd never expected to find. And it had taken nearly losing everything to discover it was possible. But now that I knew what it felt like to be truly seen and supported by the people who mattered most, I was determined never to hide that significant a part of my life again. Not because hiding was wrong, but because sharing had turned out to be so much better than I'd ever imagined possible. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.